Thank you for that generous introduction. I'll work very hard tonight to try to live up to it. I also want to say thank you to the Wabash community. I've very much enjoyed my visit to campus so far, and I have many friends on the faculty and a former student whom I also consider a friend. But this has been my first opportunity to meet the students of Wabash, and I have really enjoyed this. I just am incredibly impressed with your scholarship, your involvement in the community, your leadership, and I think that you make your teachers proud. I'm also honored to be a part of this forum because I know of the importance of Professor Brigance's contribution to my field. I know of his importance both as a teacher and also as a scholar. Among his many accomplishments, he served as the editor of our most important journal. And that one does not get an editor position without demonstrating leadership, intellectual leadership in a field. So I am quite honored to be able to speak at an occasion that honors his legacy here. And as Jeff and I were walking this afternoon to the coffee shop downtown, which is quite nice, I recommend it, I noticed as we were walking past the library, I had read about this in some of the books that were in the room where I'm staying, that his name has been added to the library, to the Crawfordsville Public Library. And this is a distinct achievement. It's not just anybody who gets their name on the public library. And as I was walking by, I noticed this. I noticed the many illustrious names on the library, including Professor Brigance's name. And I think there's perhaps no better statement of one's contribution to a community to literally have your name set in stone. So I suspect that I will not ever experience quite that honor myself, but I am happy to be participating in an event that honors such a man. By many accounts, trust is in short supply. In the United States, scholars have pointed to prominent national surveys to argue that trust in society has been declining for more than 4 decades. When asked whether they could trust the government in Washington, fewer people have answered affirmatively. Moreover, negative judgments have not been limited to distant institutions in the nation's capital. Expressing skepticism about their interactions with others, people increasingly have doubted that other people can be trusted, believing instead that you can't be too careful in dealing with other people. And scholars studying trust worldwide have reported similar trends in Canada, much of Western Europe, Japan, Australia, and elsewhere. While some scholars interpret declining measures of trust as indicating a healthy skepticism among citizens, others warn of a weakened democracy populated by less engaged citizens. In his widely cited study of civic engagement, Robert Putnam offers a glimpse of what could be lost if people stop trusting each other. Inclinations towards volunteering, contributing to charity, joining community organizations, serving on juries, giving blood, paying taxes, and more. These activities thrive when people regard each other as capable agents who have a stake in public affairs. Putnam concludes that, quote, people who trust others are all around good citizens. They cultivate the democratic norms and practices that create opportunities for wider public engagement. In this lecture, I want to suggest that democratic deliberation can help build trust. I begin with a working definition of deliberation as an encounter among interlocutors who engage in a process of considering and weighing different perspectives and proposals for issues that they see as matters of common concern. Situated in contexts, deliberation can generate controversy and conflict, revealing an agonistic quality that distinguishes it from discourse practices like dialogue. To quote Robert Ivy, a scholar at Indiana, deliberation can be a rowdy affair. My belief in the power of deliberation to build trust is based on a study of deliberation and decision-making at school boards in Wisconsin that, thank you for describing that study so elegantly. And the school districts are Beloit, Elmbrook, and West Bend. I can, during Q&A or perhaps at the reception, speak more about their specifics if you'd like. So this was a 2-year project, and as part of this project, we went to over 160 school board and committee meetings in these districts from September 2009 through May 2011. In addition, in the spring and summer of 2011, members of my team conducted 31 interviews with all of the board members and the superintendents in our districts, as well as other top administrators and a prominent community activist. Coming at the end of 2 years of field work, and perhaps enabled by this field work, these interviews produced surprisingly frank exchanges. As one interviewee told us, who was one of the superintendents, "You haven't come across at all as trying to do therapeutic work for us, as to do anything other than study." We agreed, I should note, we agreed, and it'll become clear, we agreed to quote the interviews anonymously in any presentations or publications that drew on them, and our interviewees signed a consent letter that stipulated this anonymity condition and allowed us to use quotes from the interviews. Lasting between 1 and 2 hours, our interviews followed a semi-structured, open-ended format. We modified some of the questions to account for specifics in the 3 districts, but we generally addressed 3 core areas: board dynamics, evidence use, and district culture. In preparing this protocol, this interview protocol, we expected the issue of trust to emerge in people's responses to questions about how they evaluated evidence and their descriptions of the decision-making process. Interviewees did mention trust in responding to these questions, but they also mentioned trust without our prompting throughout the interviews. We were surprised at both the frequency and the centrality that interviewees assigned to trust. Virtually all of them identified trust as central to their deliberation and their decision-making. So building on these interviews, I want to develop a deliberative model of trust as a relational practice. Mediating theory and practice, this model seeks to explain how these interviewees understood trust in their deliberation and to synthesize their responses into a conceptual framework that these interviewees themselves didn't fully articulate, but one that I hope can offer a more general model of trust in deliberation. From this perspective, this framework that I'd like to develop, trust does not function in deliberation as an all-or-nothing phenomenon that determines beforehand the success or failure of deliberation. People may transform relations of trust through their interactions, strengthening or weakening trust in deliberation. As a relationship, trust does not function as an attribute of one participant or another, but as a quality that emerges in their interaction, the relationships that they mutually construct. Participants, of course, can still earn a reputation as trustworthy, but this reputation effectively acts as a summary of recent interactions. As a practice, trust appears not as a precondition or an outcome of deliberation, but as an activity that unfolds through deliberation. As a practice, trust is something that people do. So these interviews have led me to identify 4 practices for building trust in deliberation: flexibility, forthrightness, engagement, and heedfulness. Flexibility entails keeping an open mind about one's position, other positions, and issues that are addressed in deliberation. Forthrightness means interacting honestly and sharing one's motives, one's positions, and evidence in deliberation. Engagement involves attending to, learning from, and respecting the perspectives of others. And heedfulness means to express a commitment to follow judgments reached through deliberation. My plan for this lecture is to address each of these practices in turn, drawing on excerpts from the interviews to help explain them. So I want to begin with flexibility. Addressing a variety of aspects of deliberation, a flexible approach among participants can bolster their relations and help them build trust. By remaining flexible in the positions they advocate, participants in deliberation recognize other positions as potentially reasoned and justifiable. So, for example, one board member in West Bend highlighted this point as crucial for promoting good deliberation and decision-making. Quote, "Spend your time asking questions, exploring options, do the research on the outside, and keep an open mind as long as you can until you have to make that decision." I'm not saying that you have to delay that decision, but keep an open mind during the process of evaluation. For this board member, an open mind signaled a recognition of the contingency of deliberation, which sometimes proceeds in unexpected directions. This person said, "Because you never know when you're going to get a piece of information that may change your course." An open mind enabled the agility necessary to address the unexpected. Again, this interviewee. If you lock yourself into a certain point of view without much study, it may be difficult to retract from that spot, even though you know it's the right thing to do. But you may not have the personal horsepower to do that. So don't jump on a decision too early. This board member's reference to a piece of information also illustrates that flexibility entails an openness to supporting and contrary evidence. Flexibility also may enable participants to recognize the diverse values that inform an encounter, and it may facilitate their appreciation of these values in certain conflicts. So, citing one particular controversy in West Bend, and I don't have time to explain that controversy in detail, another West Bend school board member resisted what he saw as an effort by other board members to impose their values on the district. He said, quote, "I have my values too, and you have your values, but my job is not to make you believe my values. It's to respect your values, and hopefully you respect my values." In this way, flexibility affirms the relationality of deliberation. That is, a flexible person acknowledges the participation of others. This person hears others. Moreover, flexibility suggests that my own personal view can be formed or reformed in collaboration with another. One Beloit board member stressed a key aspect of decision-making as, quote, "listening to other people's opinions before I make a vote, because I don't want to go into it and not hear anything that other people said." This board member credited interaction with others for producing better decisions. Quote, "because either I would be aware of something else, or I'd learn something from it, or it could change my mind." This statement affirms the relationality of deliberation, that we deliberate because we believe we can make better decisions with others. In this spirit, another Beloit member located the key to decision-making in, quote, "asking the right question." Asking the right question, quote, "allows us to sort our own biases, as well as those that we bring to the table, or our own agenda that we bring to the table, so we know how we're playing off each other today." So flexibility allows us to learn about ourselves and to learn about others. In contrast, the inflexible participant appears to get along just fine without others. Participation in deliberation holds no transformative power over this person's views. Belief comes from the outside, whether ideology, religious faith, hubris, or something else, and it stays outside. Now, we had one moment where there was a kind of surprising admission of inflexibility. One Beloit member struggled when asked to name a situation where somebody else's argument changed their position. Here's what this person said: "I'm usually the one that makes people change their minds. I'm trying to think. Honestly, I can't think of an experience like that. But I'm honest in saying that there have been situations where I've changed other people's minds." Now, this board member conceded that probably there had been a situation, but couldn't recall a specific example. Now, this represents an unusual case, clearly, but it illustrates how inflexibility rejects the idea of relationality, that we need others to make decisions. Without naming this board member, moreover, the superintendent in Beloit talked about the harmful consequences of this kind of inflexible approach. It stalled decision-making. Here's what the superintendent said. It's not fun when you're dealing with people who are ideological, and hold to positions no matter what. When you're dealing with people where that's where they come down, and there's no place. You can't win with them. Moreover, insofar as inflexibility produced wider divisions, it didn't confine itself to the board, it threatened the larger community. Again, the superintendent said, you destroy a community eventually with that kind of thinking. Inflexibility undermines the relationality of trust by making other people unnecessary, whereas flexibility sees the encounter as productive, as potentially transformative. Inflexibility prejudges the encounter and the outcome. It renders participation perfunctory. Now, even though we appreciate when others demonstrate flexibility in deliberation, it's true that practicing flexibility oneself can sometimes present a challenge, as that quote about changing one's mind illustrates that I just read about from the Beloit member. Committing to a position can sometimes lead us to be defensive when we're confronted with opposing viewpoints and information that challenges our worldview. Sometimes we attribute negative motives to somebody who dissents, or we regard their information as flawed or biased, or we simply disavow participation in the deliberative life of a democracy. Now, this dynamic arose in many of the interviews that we had in West Bend. So board members would profess flexibility in their own practices while charging others with inflexibility. And also they bore charges of inflexibility from others. So for example, in one interview, a board member disavowed operating with a, quote, narrow political or social agenda that predetermined his decisions on district policy. Yet here's how another person described this same board member. They said, this guy's never wrong. Just ask him, and he'll tell you he's never wrong. These conflicting perceptions, now the point isn't to determine who's correct, right? Is this guy operating with a narrow agenda or not? But just to recognize that there's definitely a tension sometimes between voicing support for the practices that we think can benefit deliberation and actually practicing those practices. Yet, even as some board members in West Bend expressed difficulties in practicing inflexibility, they did observe changes in their positions and the positions of others. So, for example, one board member recalled how his own views had shifted from a candidate to being an elected office holder. And so he ran on a platform of fiscal constraint. And yet, when he joined the board, he quickly realized that, and these are his words, that we need to invest in this community to grow the education system, to make this a stronger community. And he got confirmation in this change in his own views from the voters. He noted that he was recently reelected and, quote, with more votes than any school board member in the last 10 years has got. So we saw in the interviews how people would acknowledge what they saw as their own shift in positions and how they themselves had believed that they had exhibited flexibility. So participants in deliberation, I think we can take from this, sometimes may express inflexibility towards one aspect of deliberation while being flexible in some other way, whether it's positions or evidence or values. And one board member in Beloit, for example, noted how this was a fluid process when he said that newly elected board members underestimate, quote, how their values get pushed. I don't think people go into this process thinking, this is going to push, how do I really feel about this? In this way, I think we can see that flexibility and inflexibility are not fixed qualities. It's not that somebody is either flexible in their approach or inflexible. But these are changing qualities that can be shaped by deliberation itself. All right, so let me talk about forthrightness, the second practice. Associating trust and forthrightness attends to the pragmatic orientation of deliberation. If participants operate with the sense that others, if participants can't operate with the sense that other people mean what they say, then deliberation loses its coherence. An administrator in West Bend, for example, feared that divisions on the board had gotten to the state where this may have been the case. He said, quote, "There's so little trust that if they're not all in the room together," and by all he meant all the board members, "there's so little trust that if they're not all in the room together, they're automatically going to start asking questions," end quote. He suggested, these comments suggest that these board members doubted whether each other would report from committee meetings honestly. They wouldn't even accept kind of the summary reports of the committees that came to the full board because there was such distrust. And this clearly, this idea of forthrightness that I'm talking about resonates with our everyday use of trust in other non-deliberative contexts. We don't trust people who we think are deceiving us or people who we think are hiding things from us. And this was true on the board as well. And these were some of the practices that the interviewees regularly cited as harmful to trust, when they believed that other people were being secretive about information or they were hiding agendas from the larger board. So for example, one board member in Beloit who generally had a pretty good sense of the administration, generally felt like this person felt like she could work with the administration, nevertheless had expressed this sense of doubt about forthrightness when it came to budget deliberations. So here's what this person said, and it was because of what she thought was a lack of specificity about numbers when the board was trying to deliberate about budgets. Quote, "I feel really frustrated and upset and worried that I don't know the exact number." By exact number, she meant the number that they had to cut from that year's budget. "I feel really frustrated and upset and worried that I don't know the exact number. And I'm bothered that I also don't know why I don't know the exact number. It creates a sense of distrust, and I don't like going in having to question. Am I getting all the facts? Is the administration just trying to bamboozle us with their fuzzy math and whatnot?" And this was a fairly common complaint. In terms of agendas, another board member in this district said that her perception that board members were being driven by personal agendas had motivated her to run for office. This was the reason why she decided to run for school board. She said, quote, "I saw and heard things that the board was doing, more like personal agendas, things of that nature, and that really bothered me." Now this person, we asked, well, what do you think about your experience on the board? Do you feel like it's changed from what you saw when you were thinking about running versus what you're experiencing now that you're on the board? And she said, yeah, quote, "Yeah, it was better than I thought it was going to be, but I still see agendas, and that drives me nuts." So these perceptions that somebody on the one hand is maybe withholding information or that there are these secret agendas created gaps between people's statements and people's interpretation of their meaning. So this person said this thing, but what do they really mean? And when people discern hidden agendas and secretive information, those sort of gaps encountered. Now, what happens when, in encounters where participants do act forthrightly, what happens is the attendant risk of deliberation can seem warranted, because deliberation itself is a risky process. We're talking about this in one of our meetings earlier today. The risk of deliberation is that if you enter with flexibility, that you might end up having your view shifted, and presumably we deliberate about things that are important to us. So you might have your view shifted on something that's important to you. But one of the benefits of forthrightness is it made this risk seem worthwhile. That if people are behaving forthrightly, maybe it's okay to engage in this risk. Without forthrightness, deliberation appears as a potentially dangerous encounter where somebody makes themselves vulnerable without a sense of reciprocity, without a sense that the people that you're interacting with are behaving in a similar way. So for example, one West Bend board member located his frustration with his colleagues in this way. He said, quote, "The transparency that I feel is a problem of board members' behavior, not of the process." He said, "I think the process that we use to deliberate and to try to make deliberations works pretty well. But I fear that my colleagues aren't transparent in their behavior." So he said that there were opportunities for people when debating board issues, there were opportunities for people to share their views. But he felt that some of his colleagues didn't do that. They were resistant to kind of share how they felt about something. And here's what he said about that. He said, the way it should be is that somebody says, here are the reasons why I support this. This is what I see. This is why I'm, tell them. I try to be more transparent about how I feel about things, but I don't always see all my peers doing that. As this comment suggests that refusing to express one's reasons in deliberation rejects this sense of reciprocity with other people who presumably are participating in a process of reason giving. The person who's giving the reasons makes themselves vulnerable by exposing their reasoning to the judgment of others and the potential criticism of others. But the person who simply states their position undertakes comparatively little risk in school board deliberations. In the absence of reciprocity, if this risk seems too great, vulnerability appears as self-sacrifice. Why would you place yourself in a vulnerable position if others are not acting in kind? I want to move now to engagement. As a process of justifying values, interests, identities, and goals, deliberation offers participants the opportunity to engage other perspectives, which participants may pursue to varying degrees. At the extreme, in the absence of sustained engagement, participants may effectively disavow the kind of risk and contingency and reason giving that makes up deliberation, and instead undergo a ritualized behavior that exhibits a severe lack of trust and aversion to different perspectives. I think it's probably not the case that we often see deliberation, say in Congress. We see a series of speech making, and this is the kind of ritualized process that I'm suggesting, right? That if you're not genuinely willing to engage the other person's perspective, you kind of go through the motions, but you don't necessarily engage in deliberation. Now, deliberation does happen. I shouldn't have introduced Congress because now all the questions will be about that. Let's talk about the local level. More hopefully, engagement offers participants a chance to learn about different perspectives, including understanding why some people hold their beliefs, how these beliefs can be different from and similar to one's own, how people can take a different route to a shared judgment, how similar starting points can lead to different interpretations and different judgments. For example, a Beloit board member explained to us that the learning potential of engagement appeared especially handy during deliberations over district finances. And I can assure you that state education funding in Wisconsin and frankly throughout the U.S. is incredibly complicated. The funding formulas for local education are incredibly complicated. So here's what one board member said about this. It's valuable listening to other board members' questions and the questions that I may come up with. I think we're all learning because school finances are incredibly messy. This board member suggested that no single person, not even the most experienced board member, could address the issue as thoroughly as the group. They were able to learn together. The deliberation allowed them to learn more about this very complicated process of education financing. Learning about others also allowed participants to learn about themselves, to better understand how their own views were situated among different perspectives. That we don't simply have beliefs, but we have beliefs that exist in this pluralistic society amid all of these other beliefs, and to see where we fit. So another Beloit school board member addressed this point when they discussed their preparation, how they prepared to talk about finances, to talk about school finances. This person said, this is how she prepared. I make sure not to ask people that I knew would give me the answer I wanted. So when she prepared to talk about the budget finances, she was not looking for somebody to tell her what she thought the answer was. She specifically went to look for somebody who would give her an answer that she didn't want and wasn't expecting. So, and in this way, seeking unexpected and even undesired answers, right? Not the answer I wanted. She sought out answers that she didn't want to hear, help us engage other people and learn about different views. What engagement does is it helps us generate a sense of familiarity that facilitates relations of trust by making seemingly mysterious and dangerous differences appear knowable, even when we disagree. Now, West Bend, I've mentioned West Bend a few times in the context of division, and it's true, this was, among the 3 districts we looked at, this was the most divisive. There were clear factions on the board. And nevertheless, it was still the case that a few of the people that we interviewed in West Bend talked about experiences where they were able to develop a greater sense of familiarity, and that this became a kind of remedy for divisions that had emerged in the district, and particularly divisions that had emerged between one faction on the board and the administration. So one board member said, this is what we need to do. We need to try to engage each other to build a sense of familiarity. Here's what he said. I think we need to get to a point where we sit down and talk to each other about why, in all honesty, why I don't like somebody or don't trust them, and how we can fix that. Another board member, also in West Bend, recalled how he'd been able to bridge differences with another colleague, somebody who he kind of disagreed with about board stuff, by learning more about the person. But he admitted that this wasn't easy. Quote, it takes an effort on the board member's part to reach out to the other person on the other side and sit down and say, can we go talk so that you can learn more about me and I can learn about you? Still, this effort produced results, which this board member saw in his relationship with another colleague, again, somebody who he typically disagreed with. He said, quote, once that happens, then you can respect their opinion, and you don't have to agree with it, but you can respect it, where they're coming from, and you can understand where they're coming from. Engagement draws on the experiences that people bring to deliberation, and it modifies these experiences when they participate with somebody else. So reaching out to somebody else in deliberation can help transform these experiences in a positive way. What engagement does is it functions ethically by treating people as capable agents who can participate fully in a collaborative process of reaching judgment. By engaging, people regard each other as worthy of attention. When we lose respect for people, we don't even bother, right? You don't even bother to try to figure out who they are or what they believe. By engaging people, as I said, we regard each other as worthy of attention, that somebody else warrants the time and energy of inquiry because I may learn valuable lessons from this person. Alluding to this issue, the superintendent in Elmbrook talked about this value, both for the district, but also the value of engagement that he saw for the community. I think he made a very astute observation about society. This is another issue that came up over lunch today. He said that very seldom do people, he said in society, in the community, but also in the broader society, very seldom do people get together with people they have differences with. And so he saw the school setting, not just the classroom, but also the opportunities for the adults in the school setting, as a kind of unique opportunity for people to learn about difference. He said, quote, the public school forces people to have to get together and form community in order to move anything forward. This superintendent saw his role. This is how he described his role in this process. And he participated in the deliberations. Some of the superintendents were more explicit in kind of expressing their views. He was more of a facilitator in terms of his participation. Here's what he said. He saw his role as, quote, helping people understand each other, putting them together in places that they have to be aware of themselves, be aware of other people, be aware of what the issue is, and try to drive that to closure. And as this statement suggests, this is some of the ethics of learning about each other, of treating each other as capable agents. And also, the possibility in the sense of healing a division that sometimes appears. Now this is, the idea of awareness, of engaging is more, this is not about rule following. Engaging the perspective of another takes more effort than simply permitting somebody else to talk, or not interrupting somebody, or not using ad hominems. Simply waiting your turn, or adhering to an official code of conduct may tolerate different perspectives. It may be a form of toleration. But tolerance and engagement are two different things. Engagement is an active process. Engagement is a process of trying to figure out and learn about the other. As one board member in Beloit maintained, what engagement does is it can sometimes take conflict and see it as productive. So this board member, and this is the board member's words, saw conflict as a positive. This is the board member. Conflict can be a positive in that it generates discussion and thought-provoking. For me, often thought-provoking, thought-changing, vote-changing discussion. So while casting conflict as thought-provoking talked about how the cognitive potential of deliberation, that is how deliberation helps us learn and make better decisions, this person also talked about the ethical potential. Here's that conflict suggests, quote, the willingness to hear what somebody else is saying, the motivation to explain to you why I feel the way that I do, and to have the respect of everybody else to listen. So again, not a rule-governed procedure, but rather a cooperative procedure of recognizing other people's agency and their contributions. Now, this isn't an easy process. Engagement certainly has the potential to address power relationships that may frustrate efforts to build trust. And these power relationships come into the interactions that board members have. Again, today at lunch, we were talking about the idea of whether to take into account differences in status and background between participants. Do you focus on, there's this philosopher, argument theorist, Jürgen Habermas, who's famous for saying the force of the better argument. There's some smiles of acknowledgement in the room. Do you focus on the force of the better argument, which means that who I am and who you are shouldn't matter. What matters is what we say. Or do our differences somehow matter in terms of what we say? And this has been a kind of continuing point among scholars of interest, like what role do these play? And we saw this in our interviews, in the kinds of experiences the people had, that deliberation for them did reflect some of the power relationships. And this became one of the things that people had to try to figure out, that people had to try to negotiate as they interacted with others. So for example, in West Bend, famous West Bend, there were very clear gender and class issues that arose, and that really, in terms of engagement, frustrated efforts of people to engage each other. So the superintendent in West Bend at the time was a woman. She's since moved on to another district. And it was very clear, some people made reference to this to us in the interviews, that for some of the board members, all of the board members were men, but not for all of them, but for some of the board members, the fact that a woman was in a leadership position was difficult for them to take. That was something that made it difficult for them to engage the superintendent. And this was a clear case of how these differences in social standing and power relationships can frustrate our ability to engage others. And for the superintendent, this was, kind of a shock for her, because she's spent a lot of time mentoring young women who wanted to be administrators. And whenever she got asked questions about a glass ceiling, is there a glass ceiling? As a woman, am I going to face these kinds of obstacles in terms of school administration? She would say, no, that's BS. She used a different word, but I'll abbreviate it. she said, no, you'll be judged on the quality of your work. And for her, this was kind of a moment of realization, where she felt like the first time in her career she had encountered a situation where the fact that she was a woman working with men on the board really got in the way of them working with her and understanding her. And at the same time, too, there were class issues. So the administrators in West Bend, the superintendent held a PhD. Some of her assistant superintendents held PhDs. Some of the board members were college grads, but some of them were not. They were tradesmen. And there was also these competing kind of perceptions of what these degrees meant. Some of the board members thought that they felt talked down to, that they felt because they did not have college degrees or background in education, that they felt that the administration didn't take them seriously and didn't value their input. So there was this really powerful class and gender dynamic in West Bend that really frustrated people's efforts to build these trusting relationships. And so that's an example of how this can be difficult. What also, another kind of obstacle that people noted across the districts was the idea of publicity itself. Publicity has always been thought of as a double-edged sword, in that the metaphor, the bright light of publicity. If you shine the bright light of publicity, that can open up wrongdoing, that can hold people accountable. And certainly there's that aspect of it. But the other aspect of it that board members talked about was how publicity sometimes seemed to constrain people's participation. How maybe at some meetings there'd be hardly anybody there. But some meetings, controversial meetings, there could be hundreds of people in attendance. And at those meetings, board members would be reluctant to speak. They'd be reluctant to really kind of say what they thought because they were concerned that somebody would take it the wrong way or it would circulate in the community. They also tended to attribute this to television. The regular board meetings were televised, but many of the committee meetings were not. And some of the interviewees felt that perhaps their colleagues played it up for the camera and at the televised board meetings. Now, they also, on one hand, they would say that. On the other hand, they'd say nobody watches. But, I suppose I'm geeky enough that I watch community access TV. But I know a lot of people don't. But they nevertheless felt like there was a difference when the TV camera was there. They felt that people were kind of grandstanding a bit for the camera. So I think part of what these concerns about publicity in the TV underscore the risks of deliberation, the risks of engagement, that presumably, if we follow what some of these interviewers are saying, that the risks are greater when the audiences are larger. The risks of changing one's mind or voicing an unpopular view. And sometimes I think when people express concern about well-attended meetings, in other moments they wanted greater attendance, or they expressed concern about people grandstanding for the camera. I think what they were doing wasn't really wanting people not to attend or wanting the TV cameras to be turned off. I think it was just a kind of acknowledgement about this idea of risk, about the idea that sometimes in deliberation you might say something and you don't know how people are going to respond. But certainly as a public official, you have to say it anyway. All right, here's the final quality, heedfulness. And so what heedfulness addresses is the way in which participants' perceptions of the extent to which their deliberation matters influences their willingness to trust. So when people perceive that deliberation doesn't matter, either because somebody has initiated deliberation simply to provide political cover, or they're deliberating about a decision that's already been made, this, I think, can become a powerful source of feelings of cynicism and alienation, when you feel like deliberation is just there for show. One board member, for example, expressed concern that the district had done too much of this with community groups, that the district would commission community panels about district issues and then discount the recommendations. So here's what this board member said in Elmbrook. I'm pretty convinced that this is a bad way of doing business. If you ask a committee, a respected group of people from the community, to work on a problem, and they give you an answer, you better be prepared to take it seriously. Now, other board members didn't agree with this. They thought, no, we do. We don't always agree with the community, but we take seriously their recommendations. But nevertheless, it points to this idea of heedfulness, that people have to feel like deliberation matters if you're going to trust deliberation. This was, I think, a clear complaint of the one faction in West Bend against the administration. That basically they felt that the administration was colluding with the other group on the board to make decisions. So here's one board member, and this was actually a complaint echoed by the other people who constituted this faction. He said that, quote, issues have already been decided before they get to the board level, and you're just there to agree with it. And if you disagreed, you raised the ire of whoever was opposed, whoever was on the other side. So I felt like the process was pretty much a foregone conclusion. And now, again, this is another point where I want to say, as our role as interviewers, and even my role now as analysis, not to say whether or not this complaint is true, like was the administration colluding with others on the board, but rather just to point to the dynamic that this suggests about trust and deliberation, and about how when we perceive something to be the case, regardless of whether or not it's true, how that can be disruptive to and complicate efforts to build trust. So what do we have to do? I think part of the answer to the idea of practicing heedfulness is that people have to signal to each other and a willingness, a desire to account for, to take into account what the kinds of judgments that people reach in deliberation. Here's an example. Here's what a Beloit board member said about this. I think part of the boardsmanship is to figure out how you're going to do that. This board member is talking about when to call the question. So that is when have you had enough deliberation that you're ready to call the vote? And here's what this board member said. You have to figure out how you're going to do that because you have to live with each other every other Tuesday night. And so you have to be able to do that. So something like figuring out when to call the question and trying to figure out the right moment can be an example of heedfulness, can be an example of trying to show other people that you're deliberating with, that you're accounting for their views. Now, there's part of the problem here is that part of the problem maybe for somebody who studies deliberation is that, and maybe part of the problem for participants too, is that deliberation often talks about decisions that are basically going to be implemented after the deliberation occurs. But what heedfulness suggests is you have to figure out how during the deliberation itself, not just later on during the implementation process, but how during the deliberation itself can you suggest to somebody else that you're going to follow through, that you're committing yourself to a particular course of action. And the example of calling the question, I think, is one. It's a specific example, to be sure, but it is one example of how to do that. Other board members talked about how you could justify your decisions when they talked about the heedfulness in terms of community input, and they talked about justifying decisions in a way that explained your decision making in relation to those promises that you made to the community, so that you could at least articulate how you saw the decisions that you were making as decisions that were consistent with what you had promised. Now, the flip side is the issue is that the board members also felt that sometimes their constituents and other people felt that the only way you could heed what somebody was saying is when you did exactly what they wanted. So sometimes they thought that was a code word, that when the community says, "You're not listening to me," what the community really means is you decided to do something that I disagree with. So any example of a decision that somebody disagreed with was an example of "you're not listening to me." But I think that just shows the complexity here, the tensions here. There's no, these practices themselves are not foolproof because deliberation itself is a contingent process. And you can't eliminate that sense of contingency. You can't eliminate the prospect that somebody ultimately may still say, you didn't listen to me. But you nevertheless can undertake these practices to try to suggest this idea of heedfulness. So I want to conclude then by returning to this idea of crisis and say that scholarly concerns about an apparent crisis of trust, I think, are motivated importantly by the recognition that trust can bolster deliberation and other modes of public engagement. It goes back to Putnam's observation about trusting people being good citizens. That part of the reason that we're so worried about this crisis of trust is because we believe that trust can be really powerful. It can be powerful for a democracy. What I've argued in this lecture is that participants in deliberation themselves can build trust. Now this, I think, establishes it is a difficult, but it is also a hopeful task. It's difficult because, as I said, it's not a simple rule-governed practice. We don't simply follow a set of rules and the conclusion appears as we wish. It's not, we don't simply adhere to a procedure and generate the outcome that we want. So it's difficult. However, I think it's also conceptualizing trust in this way as something that we can build through deliberation is also hopeful. It's also a hopeful practice because it says that trust doesn't have to exist as a precondition of deliberation, especially deliberation across differences. We don't have to wait for trust to deliberate. Instead, deliberation itself may serve as the means by which we come to trust others, and our trust may become stronger with practice. Thank you. Yes.
So you kind of briefly covered how the audience, especially the number of people or the media was there, how else did the makeup of the audience add to or take from the way in which the members deliberated? Like if there was more women than men, more men than women, children were involved, students were there. Did you see any way in which that kind of affected deliberation, what was said, what was not said?
There was the folks we spoke with didn't divide the audience on those terms. To the extent to which they said more about the audience, it had to do with how informed the audience was about district issues. That the problem with these larger controversial issues is that they tended to attract the once-a-year audience member. So the person who shows up at the annual meeting about the tax levy, but doesn't show up at any other moment. And so part of the frustration was that many of the things that are discussed in a single meeting develop over the course of several. And so perhaps someone could miss, the concern about the large audience is somebody could hear something in one meeting and put it into a particular context that was different from sort of the context in which board members had addressed issues. So I think that would be the main thing that they distinguished, that the person who tended to regularly, meaning more than one time, attend board meetings could better understand the context of the issues that they were deliberating. And I think that was part of the concern they expressed.
What was the root of distrust in Westbrook? Was it like a subject? Was it socioeconomic? Was it just the way that people were comprised? What did that made it so drastic and in your speech very easy to pick on?
Right. I think that there was a shift in the composition of the board that West Bend is a conservative community, and these are all of the people I'm talking about, these different factions self-identified as conservative. So and I mention that because I think sometimes, I said this I think at breakfast, sometimes I think in this country we tend to have two categories for understanding political beliefs, and we make a whole set of assumptions about those categories, including that anybody who self-identifies as particular sort of ideological slant necessarily agrees with everybody else who also carries that identification. And in this community, I think there was a shift in the composition of the board between a group of men who while believing themselves to be fiscal conservatives, nevertheless understood taxes in the language of investment, like that guy I quoted, that you have to invest in a community. It was like a business investment. You have to invest in a community to prosper. And I think that over a 2-year period, there were 3 new people elected to the board, so it made a group of 4, including somebody who's already on, who operated with a very different kind of anti-institutional perspective, that they were already predisposed, given things that happened in the community, to kind of distrust a sort of institutional framework. So that language of investment didn't work for them. They thought it was just a kind of justification for this agenda that was already operating. So I think that was part of it. This shift in the composition of the board in fairly quick order, in basically over 2 elections, a change in majority in the board. And then I think that that these gender and class issues were very important. I think there were 1 or 2 board members who frankly had a problem with women in leadership roles, and so it was really difficult for them to be able to work with the superintendent, who's a woman. And I think for some of the others, some of the guys on the board who did not have college degrees, there was this sense that they felt disrespected from the administration, that because they did not have college degrees, the administration looked down on them and devalued their perspectives. So I think that those kinds of dynamics explained a lot of it. Yeah, I don't remember whose hand went up first, but. Part of that is kind of the fortuitousness of how sometimes you find research. When you look back on research projects, sometimes you wouldn't expect that you would have gotten to a certain particular place. I was working with a graduate student who collaborated with me on parts of this project, not the book, but parts of the field work. She's a graduate from the Education Policy Department and also the Communication Department. I co-directed her dissertation. And she was writing a dissertation on efforts by the Madison School Board to engage in community outreach. And at the same time, the William T. Grant Foundation, which is a nonprofit that invests in research about youth, had begun this new initiative on the use of research evidence. So they were funding all of this research, education, public health stuff, social welfare stuff. And at some point they started asking, what happens to this research? Are people actually using it? Because we're funding this research because we want it to get used in policy situations. So I had learned about this initiative and had an opportunity to meet with the president of that foundation and said, it sounds to me like what you're talking about is a communication problem. And he said, yeah, I think you're right, that's a communication problem. And then I said, well, I'm a communication scholar. Thank you. Earlier at lunch, people didn't find that exchange as funny. Maybe it was the Jimmy Johns, I don't know. But so I said, if you want to talk about the use of research evidence in policy, you have to look at how people make decisions in policy. And people make decisions, generally in group settings through deliberation. They have to work together. And so So I had in my mind this student who just finished and this new initiative, and thought maybe this would be an opportunity for the two of us to collaborate on parts of the field work. And that was it. But I knew that given my own interest in democracy and deliberation, that I wanted to do something bigger with this project, the book that Garrett had mentioned in the intro. So that had kind of always been in the back of my mind. And then when we finished the field work, I had sort of mapped out what I thought were some of the key issues, not just in terms of the use of evidence, but overall some of those key issues that seemed to really help us try to understand how this local deliberation was happening. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, but how did the way in which the public space affect the deliberation that took place? Because I know that it can be set up as a panel, it can be set up as a circle, and how that kind of, the room can be very big, which a lot of voices get lost in that. So how did that kind of affect the way in which deliberation was effective or not effective?
I mean, that's a good question. The very large meetings were held in, the regular board meetings tend to be a kind of conference table format, but not necessarily a table, but like a U-shape. The larger meetings were held in middle school gymnasiums, those kinds of things. It's hard to separate the space from so many of the other things that were going on in those larger meetings. I mean, people showed up angry. In West Bend, some of the budget stuff got taken up on this local talk radio show, so people kind of showed up, they're pretty riled up. People would come to these meetings sometimes carrying signs, no tax hike, or yes, 10.2, which was the hike that they eventually decided. So yeah, I think it played a part. It's hard to separate out what was distinctive about it. Yeah.
What kind of mechanism was there in the three boards for public input? How did that get received, and what were the differences among the three boards in that process?
They were quite similar in that they had some component of community input. The community were not real deliberators, and that has more to do with the structure of the meeting. Not as much the space, but more the structure of the meeting. I mean, to deliberate, community members basically got a few minutes to say what was on their mind, but there was no interaction, right? They couldn't, like they said what was on their mind, and then if a board member responded and they had a further question or they wanted to disagree, they couldn't do that. So they were there more as kind of providing testimony that the board members themselves used in their deliberation. They were board members, in all of these districts, the board members were very responsive, one might say desperately so, to try to figure out what the community thought. But save those controversial moments, people tended not to show up. Sometimes it was my research team, we were the audience. It was us, the board, and the reporter from the local newspaper. So they were desperate to figure out what people thought. They really tried to anticipate the community's opinion, and they really tried to make what they thought was a judgment that was consistent with. I mean, not that they were just, trying to aggregate opinions and then figure out what most people thought, but they understood that they were making a decision in the context of a community that had a stake in these issues. Yeah, Todd.
I'm curious about how you see your work quality. You talked about intersecting with or reinforcing or challenging some of the work done in political science on theories of deliberative democracy. And some of that, of course, is supportive of communication. Some of that is skeptical of what happens.
Well, do you mean more like the empirical stuff in political science or more the theoretical political? Okay. Right. Okay. So the political theory in political science, and I know there's a lot of political science majors in this room, so you can correct me in the reception. It's something of a bipolar discipline in the sense that people tend to be strict empiricists or theorists, but political theorists and the scientists tend not to talk to each other a lot. Is that fair? No. Or just yes or no? All right. So the political theorists who study deliberation, that will be what was remembered. This is the guy who insulted political science. It's not an insult, I swear to you. I think that the political theory written on deliberation tends not to engage actual practices of deliberation. I think it's highly theoretical. It's highly idealized. It imagines. There's this woman. What's her first name? Her last name is Markovits, and she talks about this as the gentleman's club model of deliberation, sort of white-gloved model of deliberation. That the parody of the British House of Lords, that we address each other in high-minded tones, and that we are always dispassionate, and that we always aim for consensus, and we operate with a kind of universalist reason. I think that this project and other projects, I would say, in rhetoric, really get it. I mean, deliberation is a messy process, and that's okay. And it's not a bad thing. Maybe it's pretty good that deliberation is a messy process, and it's not. And it's okay to get angry in deliberation. It's okay. It's okay to be impassioned. It's okay to sometimes kind of talk in a series of non sequiturs because you're trying to figure out what you're thinking as you're speaking. And that all of those things, that these these practices invite all of that. That flexibility, for example, can be a struggle. Like you really want to say, man, I'm right, and what you're driving me crazy, but you're still trying to fight to say, I need to hear this person out. So I think kind of the messiness of deliberation, the idea that it can be confrontational in a good way as long as we're engaging, that aspect of deliberation I think is what this kind of work, and I'm certainly not the only person in communication to do it, but what this kind of work I think shows us.
Well, just one.
All right, one more.
Very practical point. Did you ever encounter the Tea Party?
Well, nobody ever self-identified in that way, but there were definitely people on these boards who participated in organizations that were in various ways, directly and indirectly, related to Tea Party groups. So yes, they made their presence on these school boards, absolutely.